Hello, I'm Paul Orselli, President and Chief Instigator at Paul Orselli Workshop, and I am delighted today to be joined by Jeff Kennedy from his basement workshop in an undisclosed location in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right?
That's it.
How are you, Jeff?
I'm great, Paul. Good to see you.
Yeah, nice for you to join me. So we're going to talk about a couple things today, but I always like to ask people how they got into doing what they're doing, because I think it's interesting. We have a lot of students and emerging museum professionals who tune in to the videos. And so I think it's always interesting to hear how people got started in this business. So how did you get started in this business?
Okay, well, let me do the quick bio that will take us back to college days. Um, I was at Brown University as an undergrad, and I came as a pre-med student in an almost brand new 5-year intensive pre-med program. And I had arrived from Portland, Oregon, not knowing much about the school I was going to, one that was virtually unknown at the time. And I ended up within 3 months bailing from pre-med and taking the first art course of my life. And by the time I graduated, I was studying art and architectural history and sculpture. I learned to use table saws, band saws, weld, et cetera, in my art classes at Brown. So I was doing sort of hands-on work, and then I went to graduate school at Rhode Island School of Design in industrial design, where I worked on some design of biomedical instruments, some work for the Red Cross. But for a graduate thesis, I worked on the Boston Bicentennial Exhibition with a design firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Oh, wow.
So by the time I got to school, I had done some work with exhibition design. And then my first professional job was back in Portland, Oregon, where I returned for a while and was hired at the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry as an exhibition designer. And I was there for 5 years. So that's how I got into it, Paul.
Wow, that's quite a trajectory. I'm glad I asked for somebody who you took your first art class at Brown and then made the leap to RISD, that super heavy duty art and design school, and then to OMSI. Wow.
Yeah. And I think the important continuum was that RISD was a very hands-on school. I mean, you had to build prototypes and models of everything, et cetera, et cetera. And that's where I learned, then I started taking metal shop and, side courses that I could take with undergraduates to really hone in on some of the other machine shop skills and so on.
Wow, that's awesome. Well, I love a designer and a developer and a creative person who comes by their trade honestly and can do stuff with their hands. So good for you. You were,
thank you.
So just as a sidebar, so when you were at OMSI back in the day, was that when Shab Levy was there too?
Shab, my best friend, and he and I started doing freelance exhibition design together. We did some projects for Aztec together.
Yeah.
And then after I moved back to the East Coast, I remained, we continued to do projects together for a while. So yes, Shab Levy is one of my very best friends on the planet.
Yeah. He's another great, honest designer, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, interesting. You mentioned Aztec, because part of what prompted this conversation was something I had seen. Everything's connected in this business, and I had seen a post recently from Seb Chan from Australia, his email newsletter, and he gave a shout out to your book, User Friendly. And I thought, Wow, user friendly. I love that book. I have several copies of that book, and I thought, I didn't even realize that that excellent book is available for free download from your website. So this is also a big shout out to your work on that book. But I'd be interested just to talk a little bit about that, because I think even more so maybe that you can get it for free. Sorry. That people can access that book. I think it's still an awesome resource and a reference. So what was the genesis of user friendly? And great title, of course, for interactive exhibits and all things of that nature, that
Yeah.
part of the museum world.
Yeah. Well, the Genesis, it's really an Aztec project. So Wendy Pollock and Sheila Grinnell really cooked it up. They got the grant to do the book, and they came to me to engage me as the primary writer. But especially Wendy directed the entire project, and she had a very good view, I think, of a changing world of inclusive design, a word that probably wasn't used at all at that time. This was probably 1988 or 89, because the publication date is 1990, the first time, the first printing of it. And so all the credit goes to Aztec and Wendy for getting the ball rolling. But I think they were primarily thinking about ergonomic design. And I'm not, and because when they came to me, I think they knew, well, that's an area that Jeff knows because he went to design school, he studied that sort of thing, so he could be good with this. And I'd worked with Aztec on a number of projects, so I knew Wendy and Sheila, and we were all comfortable with each other. But they were putting out at those times when they were getting grants for these publications, they were quite modest. In fact, Schaub Levy did one called something crates and wheels or something, cogs, crates, and wheels, or
traveling exhibitions,
traveling
right?
exhibitions. Yeah. And it was about this thick, it was a little pamphlet. And I think when they started this project, Paul, I think we were going to do a little pamphlet. And then Wendy just kept learning about the more people she talked to, the more she learned about things, and it just grew. And
the pamphlet kept growing and growing.
It kept growing and growing. So, but anyway, that's sort of the genesis of it in a nutshell.
Well, I think I'll say again, it's worth a trip to your website to learn some more about you and your work, but also an extra special trip in the context of this video there, where people can get a hold, I guess, of a PDF of user friendly.
Yeah, that's right.
Since this video will ultimately be on YouTube, as they say, down below in the description, we'll include links and important things that connect people to stuff we talk about on the video.
Yeah.
So we're not going to recap the entire book today. Obviously, people can download it and take a look at it for themselves if they don't already know it. But I'm just wondering, sort of in this spirit of looking back and looking forward, and the more things change, the more things stay the same. If there are aspects of things that you wrote about or that were covered in the book, you mentioned ergonomics and different sorts of interfaces and different sorts of user affordances. What sort of things maybe have stayed the same or changed the most in the past 30 some years? That's quite a
that's a
chunk of time.
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things I'll add in before getting to that question specifically is that the approach to the book is to have a large number of images, pictures, to demonstrate the issues being discussed. So it's not a book that runs along in the text. I mean, there's certainly good explanations along the way for everything's being covered, but it is primarily using visual assets to get at the issues that we're trying to address. That, and I think the other good idea we had, I think Wendy and I came up with it together, was having a checklist at the end. The
Yeah.
checklists have gotten to be bigger and bigger over time, but I think it was a great idea. And if you go back to the checklist, that's one way to see what wasn't covered, because there's an awful lot that you would throw in if you were doing this now. But to back to mentioning that this is a 30-year-old publication, 1990 was almost a seminal time in what was going on with exhibition, thinking, development, design, etc. So 1990 was the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, was passed. I think the first standards that came from that were probably a year or two later. 1990, what else was going on then? Well, let me just move on, because the main thing is that there were no voluminous standards, or hardly standards of any sort. So the sort of, since this book, there were fabulous bodies of work done by the Smithsonian, design guidelines for accessible exhibits. I'm not sure what year that came out. I think Jan Majewski was the primary author of that. Just an incredibly important document. And then the National Park Service started doing really great documents along these lines. So though, I mean, this is like a very junior version of anything like that, but this was ahead of its time a bit. I mean, this was like the first.
I mean, thin edge of the wedge. I mean, an idea that was sort of taking on the zeitgeist of all those sorts of changes swirling around the business. I think.
Right. Yeah. And people like Betty Davidson, who's no longer with us, but she was at Museum of Science in Boston, and she was, a national, international leader in awareness of how design and accessibility needed to come together. And having her in the backyard here was huge. And I think I barely knew Betty when working on this. I got to know her through it, and then we became lifelong friends. So again, Paul, it's just like this was a beginning, a very transitional time. So I was sort of thinking about things that have changed as I was looking through the checklist and so on. And what amazes me most is how specialized the various research studies and papers and publications have been. So recently, in the last 5 years, I've done a fair number of projects where the IHCD, the Valerie Fletcher and the Institute for Human-Centered Design is involved. Do you know them, Paul?
Yeah, sure. A little bit.
Yeah. So they have really pushed the boundaries, and I won't go into everything that they do, but primarily because of the technologies that are now available, there are many ways to communicate with visitors that simply were not available so long ago as this was written.
Sure, of course. Yeah. And all the continuing impact of digital and multimedia devices in exhibits, of course, over that period of time, how much that impact continues. And maybe they were still talking about how virtual reality was going to be the next big thing 30 years ago. sorry, little editorial comment there.
I was also thinking something as basic as captioning. Captioning was just coming along. I don't know. We used to collaborate with the caption department at WGBH because they were also leaders in best practices for captioning, for instance. And then, as you know, everything became open captioning not too long after, and a lot through efforts of people like Betty who were saying, there's advantages. I think this was one of the best pitches she ever made, and she made it all the time, is that these changes, these adaptations, these evolutions to, say, open and captioning, for example, it's better for everybody.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So if you have a noisy space, you can read the caption,
Well, I mean, it's interesting how many of those things that were maybe initially considered specialty or niche, or like, oh, this is for a particular audience, really sort of started to move into the notion of universal design. And the captioning example you gave is a good one. I mean, I watch, my wife and I watch TV with my 86-year-old mother-in-law, and we like to turn on the captions if we're watching also a British television show or something. Sometimes you can't catch everything somebody's saying, but you can with the captions. So it's super interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to shift gears a little bit, because I think it's no accident that you're joining us from. I love the background of your basement workshop there. I can see like tools and a chop saw over to one side, and of course your computer monitor on the other side. It's like you've got the yin and yang of the digital tools and the physical tools right there. I'd just be interested to hear you talk a little bit, not only how having access to a range of tools, both digital and physical tools, informs your practice and your work, but also how you think having access to a range of tools also has an impact on the people and the places we work with in museums. So I threw you a big general softball in your direction, but I'd be super interested in you talking about tools and capacity and how that informs your work and our work in general.
Sure. I'll start off with something, Paul, and then you can continue to steer it if you want to as we go. So, the reason I want to have tools around and have always had tools around, I've never had I should say I have a design business, and we've done a wide range of work for science centers, natural history museums, National Park Service, National Science, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so having a shop was simply a place where we could go to have ideas, to generate ideas, to investigate ideas. And sometimes we were just out fooling around. We weren't working on a project. We weren't working on this or that, but we'd seen something or read something or something came about where we want to go. Yeah, hey, let's go try it out. Let's see if that really works. So always had a shop from the very, very get-go. First place I ever rented, I set up my shop. It was just like pro forma. You had to have a shop. I mean, there was no other way to do it. And what it surprised me, Paul, is my background is as a designer, in quotes, but I didn't know any other design firms that had shops. I mean, it was just like a mystery to me. Like, how can this be? What do? They just sketch things and then they send them to somebody to build?
Well, I think you could ask the same question over the period of time we're talking about museums too, because it seems like, if you're talking a number of years ago, it seems to me like every museum, whether they were a big museum or a small museum, had some sort of shop where they could mess around or they could fix things that needed to be fixed or prototype something. Yeah. And I think both in the case of designers and museums, institutions, something's lost when you don't have that space to play around with ideas, like to think with your hands.
Right. Yeah. And Paul, you and I both spent a lot of time in science museum environments, correct?
Sure.
And children's museum, I know you did, and we've done work with them. But I think science museums in particular have these shops. And Frank Oppenheimer, he was obviously, his book on prototyping was, I mean, that was like a Bible. And so
I'm
there
just
was that.
laughing. They used to say, though, you had to be careful when Frank was in the shop. He was might get hit with a piece of 2x4 or something while he was moving things around.
Yeah. And I think, well, you and I talked a little bit about the fact that now when new science centers are developed and designed and constructed, often they have very little shop space.
Or
and I'm not
none.
Or none. Yeah. And well, I think we'll just not go there. We'll just, people can draw their own conclusions.
We probably the fact that you're sitting in the place that you're sitting in, and the fact that I've smacked my head a couple of times already probably says enough about that.
Yeah. It was interesting. I just finished a project with Boston Children's Hospital, and we did primarily a historical exhibit, but we called it Boston Children's A to Z. And this will be familiar to you because, if you have a collection of objects, they had a great collection. No, well, they had a vast collection of historical objects, none of which had much interpretive value. So we created this A to Z where there's 26 objects and everyone has a 1 or 2 sentence story. And it's find the objects. And so one thing that was desired was one interactive exhibit. We just have to have one thing. So ended up with a video microscope, no moving parts, et cetera, et cetera. Except that the owner wanted to be able to move something back and forth under the microscope. So it just had to have limited range movement. Anyway, I built the prototype right over there. And, I had to have the microscope. I had to have the exact microscope that would be used, the exact light, et cetera, the exact objects that we were going to examine underneath it. And only then can you figure out all these little design details. And I worked with a competent fabricator, but honestly, the things that you and I would look at and use and incorporate into our design are not things that are top of mind for them. And so you either end up having them do it over and over and over, even though let's say you do a CAD drawing, here's what we have in mind, you build it now. It's more expedient to make the prototype yourself. That's what I think. Not for everything, but I mean, when you can, you do. When you can, you do.
But I think that sometimes the value of quick and dirty, cheap materials, like, the thing is, even something as simple as where you want to place a monitor on the wall. I mean, you can cut out a piece of cardboard that's the same size as your monitor and stick it in different places and say, hey, what if there's a group of people here? There's somebody in a wheelchair. There's, is this too tight or something? I mean, I've been to lots of exhibitions, as I'm sure you have, where you feel like, I don't know that anybody thought about, like, maybe they did a drawing, but I don't think they were thinking about how this worked in the actual physical real world. So.
Well, Paul, you bring up a really critical point, and that is, let's say you don't know how to use shop tools. Well, fine. There are still so many things you can just try out. Just the thing you just now mentioned, you can do that with foam core and some cutting mat surface, and an X-Acto.
Blue tape
all the time. My best friend, blue tape. And you can rent a wheelchair if you're not sure about something, I've done this over and over again. We're trying to dissuade a government agency from putting highly reflective acrylic on a graphics rail. And you can mock that up really quickly with foam core and a piece of plastic. You can blue tape it together. You can try it out at different angles, and you can rent your wheelchair. And we're trying to show that it was really for people who were seated, that the glare would be most a problem from almost any angle, very hard with overhead lighting not to get into trouble. And so anyway, the main point is that yes, if you don't have a shop full of things, that's fine. Don't use that as an excuse not to test out things that you have questions about, that you can troubleshoot that some other way.
Well, I'm gonna say that if people don't do anything else after they watch this video, but go to your website and download user friendly and get themselves a roll of blue tape. Those two things can help them think about their next set of designs or exhibits. I know that for sure. Well, Jeff, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. And as I mentioned, we will include links to things that we talked about, including, of course, your website where people can find out about your work and download their own digital version of user-friendly. But yeah, thanks again. It's always great to speak with you.
Paul, great to see you. Great speaking with you. And I think you do such great work. Thanks for including me in it. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Have a good day.
You too.